Hello, beloveds, and welcome to Christian Emotional Recovery, a podcast for those who are survivors of childhood trauma, emotional neglect, and narcissistic abuse. This podcast is hosted by Rachel Leroy, a college professor and trauma survivor. Many of us spend years trying to heal and don't get anywhere. We don't always target the trauma itself, which is so often what keeps us stuck. This podcast is where faith meets science. Rachel is an emotional healing expert with 20 years of experience applying healing modalities that helped her start making progress after nothing else worked. She'll show you how to do the same. Each week, we'll cover a topic that will show you how to heal trauma for good. Please check out our website and show notes at ChristianEmotionalRecovery.com and join the Facebook community, Trauma Survivors Unite, Christian Emotional Recovery.
Hello, beloveds, and welcome to Christian Emotional Recovery, the podcast that helps people find healing where they may not have otherwise. And I'm Rachel Leroy. Thank you so much for listening. And today we're doing podcast number 24, and it is the fourth in a series of 4. And the series includes practices, therapies, and practices to heal trauma, especially trauma that's stuck in the body. And so on our first podcast in the series, we did traditional practices for healing trauma, which included scripture, devotionals, teachings and sermons, prayer, and praise and worship. And then we did 5 practices to help relieve trauma in the body. And 5 of those, the second one was mind practices. The second podcast was mind practices, and that included meditation, affirmations, journaling, mindfulness, and visualization. And then the third podcast included body practices to release trauma, and those included exercise, including many subsets of exercise. And it included EFT, or Emotional Freedom Technique, also known as tapping. It included breath work, it included grounding, and it included music and sound therapy. And today we're going to cover therapies with a licensed professional, particularly focused on the body. I believe that in emotional healing and in trauma, this is not emphasized enough, that a lot of the trauma, they're starting to see that by doing scans and by studying the psychology of trauma and how it impacts people short-term and long-term. And it's proving, a lot of the research is proving, and studies are proving that these, the trauma, the reason a lot of people will do all these different things and not heal is because they're not targeting the trauma in the body where it is stuck, in the nervous system, in the brain, and in the body itself. And that's why I'm sharing these strategies. So today I'm going to cover ones that you generally do with a licensed therapist or a licensed professional of some kind, a specialist. And so keep in mind that for each therapy, I include what it is and I include disclaimers. I also include how it works and how to do it, evidence of its impact on trauma and lasting healing of that, recommended resources to get started, and advice and strategies from my experience. This girl here, me, I cannot claim to be a licensed professional, but what I can tell you is what has worked for me in my experience. Keep in mind, everybody is different, everybody's had a different experience, and everybody is wired differently. So you have to experiment and practice to see what works for you. And nothing is going to heal you if you don't consistently do the healing work. It's a day-to-day thing. You need to take breaks, and have compassion on yourself, but it's an ongoing practice, and that's how you start to see those results over the course of weeks, days, months, and years. So I want to read a disclaimer that I've included in all 4 of these particular podcasts, and it's Christian practices shouldn't be solely done for therapeutic benefit alone, like prayer and Bible study. Though it's okay to do these for these reasons sometimes, these should be done for their own sake, to connect with, glorify, and spend time with God. And these practices, however, having healing and therapeutic benefits, can still benefit you. We're talking about the traditional practices. So now, with some of the other practices, and with traditional practices, for some, traditional practices are enough to heal, but for many, they don't fully get the trauma out of the body. I spent years struggling with this, and people would say, you don't have enough faith, you're not praying hard enough, and that's a bunch of baloney a lot of times. If you're doing your best and it's not working, you need something else to help supplement it, and I believe God gave us these practices to help us to heal, so we can reconnect with Him and live the life that He intended us to live, free from trauma. If this is the case, there is nothing wrong with you. You don't lack enough faith. You're not deficient, and it is not your fault. Keep in mind, I'm not talking about people who wallow in self-pity and they want attention and they won't do anything to work on themselves and heal themselves and take accountability. I'm talking about, and I believe and assume that that is you, that you have good intentions, that you're willing to do the work, that you're taking accountability, that you're loving yourself, and you want to be surrendered to God and allow this process to work in a way that it can only work if you find the right practices. So also keep in mind that I believe God gave us these alternative therapies, and He wants us to use them because He knows and knew that some of us would need them, and that that's the only way we would heal. If they help people heal when nothing else does, these therapies are a gift from God to restore us to Him, our loved ones, and ourselves. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into the body therapies with a licensed professional to heal trauma. And I want to make a note about this particular set of therapies as well. Keep in mind that when working with a licensed professional, please go see them with a list of questions you want to ask them. When you're assessing trying to find a new professional, whether it's a therapist or a practitioner in one of these areas, and make sure you have a set of questions and you do your research. Moreover, never see anyone who does not validate the existence of trauma, isn't specifically experienced and or trained in trauma, and who does not understand the nature of narcissistic abuse and or emotional neglect, depending on your situation. Because there are a lot of therapists, they're still doing things based on 30 years ago, and they are not doing new research, and a lot of them will actually re-traumatize you. So please, therapy is important, but you've got to be your own advocate. You've got to take care of yourself. You've got to do your research. So please make sure you do your research and filter these people. And if something doesn't feel right, don't go back to them. Keep looking until you find the right person that has compassion, that knows what they're doing, that understands the nature of trauma and can work with you, and maybe even has professional credentials that give them experience in this area, but definitely real world experience with people. So, moreover, never see anyone, like I said, who doesn't validate the existence of trauma. While we must all take accountability for our condition, also never see someone who blames you for your condition. Been there, done that. I had somebody who, one time I was telling them something I went through, and I was comparing myself to somebody else. I wasn't proud of myself. They shamed me for comparing myself to that other person. They told me that maybe that other person was just making better choices than me, and told me that I was just feeling sorry for myself. Well, you know, even if some of that could be true, that is not how a therapist is supposed to speak to you. A therapist should have compassion, should be tactful, and yes, they should be honest, but that is not, if somebody does that to you, then do not go back to them. That is emotional abuse. There is a way to do things, and the whole in your face and honesty thing, I think you can still do that and do it with compassion. And there are also times and ways to do things. So keep in mind that never see someone who blames you for your condition, shames you for your lack of progress, or compares you to other people or judges you. These are red flags, and you should run away. Even if it takes longer, shop around and find someone who understands trauma, PTSD, narcissistic abuse, and its long-term impact, and is compassionate, patient, knowledgeable, and results-oriented. Also, if they only want to talk about effects and symptoms, there's nothing wrong with that in conjunction with getting to the root causes of difficult emotions, trauma, depression, anxiety, etc. But if they only work with those and they don't work on the root causes, what went wrong, etc., then you're likely not to see much results. So find someone who understands and focuses on root causes and works towards healing where the trauma and emotions are in the mind, soul, spirit, and body. Keyword body. Don't exclude the body because at least 50% of healing work for trauma survivors may be in the body. That's just a guess, but it is very body oriented. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. One therapy, the first therapy is EMDR. That's EMDR. And that stands for eye movement desensitization, and reprocessing. And it's pretty accepted in the Christian community. It is kind of strange when you first hear about it if you've never heard about it, but it is, based on the clinical research, one of the most effective ways of getting trauma out of the body. Once again, it is a very intense and very delicate process, so you need someone who can actually help you release trauma and not re-traumatize you, and that's why doing that research on the right therapist is so important. But it's a very specialized practice that has been proven to help people release traumas from the brain and body in much less time than many other therapies. And it's used for trauma, PTSD, CPTSD, and other forms of emotional and mental illness. So Healthline, an article in Healthline says this about EMDR. During the EMDR therapy sessions, you relive traumatic or triggering experiences in brief doses while the therapist directs your eye movements. I know, weird, huh? It sounds strange, but it works. I know so many people who have done it raved about the results when they found the right therapist or practitioner. EMDR is thought to be effective because recalling distressing events is often less emotionally upsetting when your attention is diverted. This allows you to be exposed to the memories or thoughts without having a strong psychological response. Over time, according to Healthline, this technique is believed to lessen the impact that the memories or thoughts have on you. And that literally, physically releases trauma from the body. So a little bit about how it works. How do you do it? Can you do EMDR on your own? That's a good question, and there's a lot of disagreement on that. You need to do your own research. You need to use discernment and prayer, of course. But getting the most out of the therapy, having the safest environment, and having the best guidance, it is recommended that you work with a licensed and trained therapist or professional in EMDR. There is a certain amount of EMDR you can do on your own, but proceed with caution. It's a very powerful therapy. Make sure you've done your homework and your research and you know the technique like the back of your hand. This therapy isn't likely to lead you down a wrong path spiritually, but it can be powerful and deep in its experience. So it's good to do the healing work in the presence of someone who can witness, guide, validate, and guard your safety and your experiences. So evidence of the impact that it has had on trauma healing, the role EMDR plays in healing the brain. There's a Psych Central article. I'll include it in the resources. And the study proves the efficacy of EMDR. It proves the efficacy of EMDR. And just very briefly, it says the roles of neuroplasticity and EMDR, the roles that they play in healing from childhood trauma. And this is an article by Zoe Reyes, and she's an LMFT. And there, like I said, it talks about the power of neuroplasticity and how it impacts the brain. And then it also talks about EMDR and its impacts on the brain and how it basically helps to release that trauma from the neural pathways in the brain. And the repetition of that helps the neurons create new connections. And then it talks about how the thalamus, which is part of the brain, helps us to distinguish between information that is relevant and non-relevant, acting like a filter to help us concentrate and focus. This function is weakened by those who have PTSD, which results in an overload of information. In order to manage the sensory overload, individuals will sometimes either shut down or numb through the use of substances. But basically, EMDR currently hypothesizes that individuals who have PTSD have stored the trauma memory in their nervous system, and the same way that it was first experienced. If you get triggered, it's like it's happening all over again. This is why EMDR is so helpful, because it helps you to go back and relive that moment, but it gives you a way to discharge it from the body. And that's really what EMDR does. Also, there is an interview in the New York Times from the original creator of EMDR. And so I will also include that link. And her name is Dr. Francine Shapiro. And she discovered this through trial and error and then perfected the process. And she is a licensed therapist. She's got a PhD. And the interview just she's talking about EMDR and how she discovered it and how it works and how it can help people and how it's a form of exposure therapy. So that'll give you some more good overall knowledge of EMDR. And then the Psych Central article, like I said, talks a little bit about it as well. And then, so when it comes to EMDR, recommended resources, I've already included a couple, but there's a good overall resource that answers a bunch of questions about EMDR, and I will include that, and it's emdr.com, frequent questions. And it answers questions for clinicians and for laypersons. So what is EMDR therapy? And it breaks it down based on that. Treatment description, what is the theoretical basis? So this is a more technical one that gets more into the science of it. I won't read all of the information off of that, but you can look at that. It's a pretty technical article, so it can help you see the science behind it. And then there's another organization that is specializes in EMDR, and they're called the Parnell Institute. And I've heard of them. They are a reputable source for healing trauma. So you may find some other stuff to help you with trauma as well. And it's PARNELLEMDR.com. And that's, it tells you a little bit more about EMDR as well. It hooks you up with more resources and strategies and practices and therapists. So, and then lastly, there's another one called the Maybergerinstitute.com. Maybergerinstitute.com, and I will include that link as well. That also provides education tools and resources. And then a general article on EMDR and Christianity. There is one in the Mayberger Institute. It's more of a generalized one, but I think it'll be helpful to help you to see the connection and how EMDR is used by a lot of therapists, including Christian therapists. And I'll also link that article in there so you can see how it's connected to faith and how it's helped a lot of people of faith. And then the advice and strategies from my experience in terms of EMDR. Basically, when you do EMDR, you close your eyes and you move them in a very specific pattern. It sounds really weird, kind of like tapping, but it works. And like I said, you don't want to just randomly try it, but you want to study it and practice it and be educated on it before doing it, and probably best to do it with a licensed professional. So check out the resources on doing EMDR yourself. It is probably, in terms of therapy, the most powerful therapy in the body for healing trauma with a therapist you can get, arguably. If not, it is one of the most powerful in removing trauma from your nervous system so you can finally discharge it and be free from those triggers and those reactions and be able to find that relief and that peace. So check out those resources, but proceed with caution doing this one. This one is best done with a licensed therapist in most cases, specifically trained in EMDR. And since you're digging up old traumatic memories, particularly if the hyperarousal response is still strong, your triggers are strong, you'll want to work on this one with someone who can guide you and keep you safe. And like any therapy, these should be done with care, discernment, and patience, but they are a gift from God. And recent advancements in neuroplasticity and healing are phenomenal. I'm so thankful for those, and I'm sure you are too. It's just amazing what advances we've done even in the last 15 or 20 years. So therapy number 2 that you would want to do in most cases with a licensed professional would be cognitive behavioral therapy. Again, a cognitive behavioral therapy you can do on your own, but if you have someone, you've got that person to mirror you, to guide you, to keep you accountable, to see you, and to protect you. And so, again, pick the right therapist and do your homework. But cognitive behavioral therapy is probably one of the most popular and common forms of therapy. And it is a mainstream and respected form for therapy that has been proven to help trauma survivors repattern their thoughts, dismantle the negative thoughts and emotions coming from trauma, and restructure those thoughts to reprogram the brain's trauma patterns to a more functional and healthy model. So, cognitive behavioral therapy is, I believe, more in the mind, but it's also in the brain, so it does connect to the body. Please note that some studies do show limited effects for those whose trauma is more complex in terms of cognitive therapy. So it may be better to start with body and mind-based therapies besides this, but like I said, you may want to talk to a professional who can recommend what might be best for you. Speak with a licensed professional about your best options. So I'm not telling you don't use it or don't use it first. I'm not a professional. Like I said, I'm not licensed, but that's what a lot of the research has shown, and it's something to keep in mind. So I've got some articles also that I'll put in the resources on treating adults for childhood emotional abuse and neglect, and it's traumacenter.org. And there's also an article that looks at the effects of cognitive behavioral therapy, also known as CBT, on different forms of PTSD. One of the articles is at traumacenter.org, and it is an article that talks about treating adult survivors of childhood emotional abuse and neglect, a new framework. And it just breaks down that whole process, and it includes cognitive behavioral therapy as one of the models. It's a very technical article. It's written by Elizabeth Hopper, the Trauma Center of Justice Resource Institute in Brookline, Massachusetts. So I'm not going to read anything from that, but that's a resource you can check out. And there's another one from the NCBI and the National Institutes of Health. It also is in the U.S. National Library of Medicine, and that's from the NIH. But it's called Cognitive Behavioral Therapy for the Treatment of PTSD, a review. I abbreviated it. And it basically talks about how cognitive therapy has been used in the management of PTSD for many years, and it reviews the effectiveness of CBT for the treatment of PTSD following various types of trauma, its potential to prevent PTSD, methods used in CBT, and reflects on the mechanisms and actions of CBT. So a lot of this just sounds very technical. Basically, cognitive therapy is behavioral therapy, and it helps you to recondition your mind. And a lot of trauma and a lot of emotional issues in the brain are programming. So it's literally reprogramming your brain in a lot of ways. And a little bit more about this particular practice. Evidence of it healing trauma. There is an article in Psych Central and on cognitive behavioral therapy and its impact on childhood trauma. And there are 7 forms of therapy for trauma in children. So this targets children, but a lot of this is relevant for adults too. But it says strong evidence showed that individual and group cognitive behavioral therapy can decrease psychological harm among symptomatic children and adolescents, so I would assume adults too, exposed to trauma. Evidence was insufficient to determine the effectiveness of play therapy, art therapy, pharmacological medicine therapy, psychodynamic therapy, or psychological debriefing in reducing psychological harm. This proves that cognitive therapy is effective in treating trauma in children. If it works in children, it will work in adults because trauma stays stuck in the body and in time. And so the brain literally doesn't know the difference between trauma that happened 20 years ago and trauma that's being relived now. And it does say that there's strong evidence that shows that individual and group cognitive therapy can decrease psychological harm among symptomatic children and adolescents. And I would assume that would include adults as well, even though they're not included in this study, because they have the same brain, and trauma does not change over time unless you heal it. So a little bit more about it. What are recommended resources? I've already shared some of those. And even though the title seems kind of corny, one book that helped me change my thinking was Feeling Good by David Burns. And that one basically takes you through 10 logical fallacies. I don't think that's the right word, but basically ways that you have distorted thinking and how that distorted thinking can impact your day-to-day mood and your day-to-day life. And it helps you to identify those 10 distortions you might have in your mind. This is work. You write them down through the day. You notice them. You keep account of them. You write down the different things you're thinking with a distortion. I'm not remembering the exact distortions right now, but let's say that you're thinking something negative and it's a distortion. You would identify that distortion, you would write it down, and then you would change that thinking. So it is a lot of work, but it can be something that will help you to improve your thinking processes. And I will include that book. It's called Feeling Good by David Burns. It really helped me out a lot in the past. But there are a lot of great resources and manuals on doing cognitive therapy on your own, which is fine. But doing it with the guidance of the right therapist can increase results and speed it up, since they can guide, motivate, and provide insight and moral support. So keep that in mind as well. I've also found that doing CBT on my own is in a more targeted and systematic approach in changing my thought patterns is more effective, partly impacted by childhood trauma, emotional abuse, and neglect. I found some relief, but this was one of the therapies that didn't work as much for me. But that doesn't mean it won't work for you. Everybody's different, like I said. So do the research and try it. It may work wonders for you. So try it and see how it works. But also, everyone is different, so test and see what works for you. It may work great. And if you have comorbidities, like different conditions along with trauma, or CPTSD like I did, this may be a therapy that will be more effective once you've done some clearing and healing work around the worst core traumas that block you, weigh you down, and affect your mind, body, and spirit. So again, use caution, use discernment, but cognitive behavioral therapy is very accepted in Christian communities. And so it's usually one that you do with a therapist, but there are also books, resources, and tools where you can do it on your own as well. The next tool that you can do with a guided professional is somatic therapy. Somatic therapy, and that literally means in the body. Somatic therapy is a holistic therapy that studies the relationship between the mind and body in regard to the psychological past. So some of what I've already been talking about is the somatic therapy, but I thought it deserved a category of its own. But according to Psych Central, it says the theory behind somatic theory is that trauma symptoms are the effects of instability in the ANS, or the autonomic nervous system, which is in the body, obviously. Psych Central, I'll put that link up for that article as well, that gives you a little more on somatic therapy, what it is, different types of it, resources you can use, and stuff like that. But somatic therapy is one of the most effective therapies in releasing trauma stuck in the body. I mentioned one specific course above, and that was Peter Levine's. In a previous podcast on these practices, I mentioned Peter Levine's somatic program. And he's done a lot of books on trauma, and he's one of the foremost and most experienced experts in the field. So I recommend checking out his books and checking out his courses. He has a course on releasing trauma that applies this approach. It applies somatic therapy. It basically takes you back to a traumatic moment, has you ground yourself in the body, and then has you relive this moment while staying in your body and releasing the traumatic memory and emotion from your autonomic nervous system. And that's basically what somatic therapy is in different forms, though there are variations on how it's done. So somatic therapy can also be grounding, or grounding can be a form of somatic therapy. And that was also mentioned in a previous podcast on these practices. But there are several ways to ground yourself. Breathing is one, but I made breathing its own category because it's so fundamental. And some of the other strategies like somatic therapy by Peter Levine overlap with grounding, but since there are so many kinds, I made this one its own category. I explained how to do it in the last column, or in the last category. Maybe I'll come up with a simple guided exercise for this one in the near future. I would, like I said, like to come up with exercises, tutorials, and guided meditations that can help you actually do some of this stuff, where I can actually provide you with some basic tools to help you with it. But scientific breakthroughs are starting to catch up with Chinese medicine and other practices that prove a connection between the body and the mind. It's one of those things we know intrinsically, and that's common sense, but a lot of people are resisting it. But the science is starting to back it and prove that Chinese medicine and body therapies and somatic therapy, they're one of the most viable ways to heal the body of illness and of trauma. Somatic therapy basically uses this connection with specific exercises to release trauma from the autonomic nervous system. So, evidence of impact on trauma healing. All right, so you may hear my cat snoring in the background. You know, she sleeps while I work, so she has a really hard life. So you may hear a little from my cat. I'm sorry about that, but it's all part of the comic relief. So there were some resources here, and one was from Psych Central, and it talks about how somatic therapy can help patients suffering from psychological trauma, and how somatic therapy can help. So I will include that one. And there's another article that is from Frontiers in Neuroscience, and it's frontiersin.org, frontiersin.org, and there is a more scientific-based article. The other one is more layman's terms, but it's called Effect of Somatic Experiencing Resiliency-Based Trauma, Treating Training on Quality of Life and Psychological Health as Potential Markers of Resilience in Treating Professionals. I will not repeat that title again, but it's by Neil Winblad, Michael Changaris, and Phyllis Stein. And I will include this one. This is more scientific on the effects of somatic therapy on basically resilience. And people that suffer from and are weighted down by deep trauma are not resilient. And that is not their fault. It's because of things that has happened to them, has blocked their ability to have full functioning. It's kind of like if you have your heart and you eat all this greasy, unhealthy food, and or you have high cholesterol and you have bad genes, and your arteries start to get clogged, and then your heart has to beat even faster just to keep up with what everybody else's does naturally. That's kind of how you're functioning in life. You're on, you're straining to try to do the same things other people do, and it's twice as hard because your brain and your nervous system is blocked and weighted down by a lot of that trauma. And that's why we do this healing work. But this article breaks down trauma, burnout, and vicarious trauma, clinician resilience and clinical outcomes, and then somatic experiencing. Somatic experiencing is actually what Peter Levine's is called. So if you're looking for his course, look up somatic experiencing, and a lot of the stuff in his course on releasing trauma somatically is focused on resilience. Resilience is being able to come back from this stuff, and that's the whole point of all the healing, right? Is to live the life that God intended you to live. So I'll let you look at that article. I'm not going to keep going into all the details of it. But just a little bit about somatic experiencing. It's one of the most reliable and reputable forms of somatic therapy, which shows promise in creating resilience-based responses to trauma therapy, which can often be draining, exhausting, and cause burnout and re-traumatization. Trauma therapy ain't for the faint of heart. You have to do lots of hard work and face and feel lots of pain. And it sucks. And it's not fair because you never asked for this to begin with. But The only way to heal is to take accountability. It's not your fault, but it's to take accountability. And the more healing you do, the more resilient you'll become. And somatic experiencing is one way to do that. And I've done one of Peter Levine's courses, and it is very effective. But that's why it's so important to do much of this work if your trauma is especially powerful or complex, with a trusted, patient, knowledgeable, compassionate professional. Sometimes we need help, and we can't do it on our own, and that's okay. Power comes not from pride and ego, but from surrender and humility. That's very scriptural. You can read it all over the place. And there are endless stories in the Bible of people who started to change the course of their lives when and only when they surrendered their trauma, problems, and pain to God and or to Christ. The Old Testament, Christ wasn't there directly, but to the power that we all believe in and follow. So somatic therapy, there's another article there, and like I said, I like to provide a lot of resources, reputable ones. There's a website called somatictherapy.net, and you can check that out. A lot of resources on finding somatic therapy for different kinds of things like stress, abuse and trauma, anger, anxiety and panic attacks, depression, eating disorders, loss and grief, and relationships. And then there's another article that includes, it's called Psychcom, Psycom, and it basically just tells you what somatic therapy is. Getting different perspectives is good too. Reading one article is not always helpful, just to get a good overall overview of it. So looking at these different articles, some of the scientific ones, and what you can understand of them. I know half of what I read, I'm like, what? And I have to go back and read it 3 times. And I'm an English teacher. So, find stuff you can understand, but if you can get through some of the scientific stuff, it can be helpful too. And this one just talks about what exactly is somatic therapy, what role does physical movement play in the work of a somatic therapist, what happens when we experience a stress response, what does a somatic therapist do, where do you start with a client, what does the somatic therapy session look like, have you found differences in the way men and women respond, and it just goes on and on with all these questions. So that one seems to be more geared towards therapists, but it can still help you figure out a specific strategy in terms of how somatic therapy is used. When it comes to, how do you do this, what resources, I'll include them in the resource list, but a list of somatic therapies you might explore or speak with your counselor about is included in some of the resources that I'll share. There's a diversity of them, and some may be more controversial than others, so as always, pray about it, read scripture, and explore to see what works for you. I believe these therapies, when applied appropriately, are a gift from God and can help us heal and find freedom from bondage. There's also an article, like I said, I'll put that Psychcom one up. And then, so my experience with somatic therapy, like I said, I've used the Peter Levine one, and it's been very effective for me. Somatic therapy is very powerful, and you can do it with a licensed professional, but there are also courses you can take that have been put out by licensed professionals. And the reason I included the grounding on one category in somatic therapy as one to do with a therapist is because there are several safe techniques, including somatic therapies, that you can do on your own, but this is also one you don't want to overlook exploring if you have complex PTSD, especially in other therapies that haven't worked. Really look into this if you have complex trauma. If your trauma is especially overpowering, doing this kind of work with a trained professional is especially helpful and important. Again, Peter Levine's Healing Trauma course is a great one to do. And while it isn't an in-person therapy session, it is effective, and he is a trained and experienced professional in this model. So the next therapy, talk therapy. Classic, again, it overlaps a little bit with cognitive behavioral therapy, and it can include a lot of different kinds of therapies. So talk therapy is what it sounds like. You talk with a therapist and you talk through your trauma. And it's kind of a similar thing as when you're writing in your journal, because you're getting that stuff out, but you still have to use some discretion and care, because a lot of people will find themselves getting caught in a cycle where they just keep reiterating trauma instead of actually releasing it. But you kind of, if you feel in your body and your mind, you kind of know which one you're doing. And that's why having a licensed therapist that you can talk to, they can help guide you and get you back on the path if that happens. So while talk therapy rarely heals trauma completely, doing this therapy, especially in conjunction with body therapies and journaling, can help people work out and make sense of their trauma experiences by understanding what went wrong, knowing what happened wasn't their fault, reliving the traumas, and releasing and relieving yourself of them on a cognitive and emotional level. So, talk therapy by itself rarely releases trauma from the body, which is why sometimes prayer, which is basically talking to God, doesn't necessarily always heal it from the body, but it does give you a way to understand your trauma on a more mind level, and that is a really important step in healing the trauma. So it does help. It just alone doesn't always completely get rid of it, but without understanding your trauma, sometimes it may take longer to release. So that's why using several strategies together is the most effective, mind and body. As of course, faith practices. But speak with a professional to figure out if this kind of therapy is helpful for your unique form of trauma and emotional difficulty. Talk therapy is widely accepted in Christian communities, and there are even pastors that are licensed in it. And often pastors are even trained to provide these kinds of counselings. So no matter what you see, please make sure they are trained, no matter who they are, and understand the nature of trauma and narcissistic abuse. And if they go telling you that your faith isn't strong enough, or that you're doing something wrong and that's why you're not healing your trauma, do not go back to see them, even if they're a pastor. I know that's controversial, but I mean that. I would rather you see a secular therapist that can help you heal, because I believe God uses everybody. And if we think he can't use somebody, we're underestimating his power to do what he wants. He's God. He can do what he wants. And if he wants to use somebody, he can use them. So just be careful who you go to. Well, that's all I'm saying. No matter who you see, though, be careful there. And if they don't know anything about trauma or narcissistic abuse, they are not the therapist for you. Straight up, if that is a situation that you've experienced. So talk therapy. So how do you do it and how does it work? Talk therapy is when you and your therapist come up with a plan for a certain amount of time or ongoing to talk through root causes. Again, make sure they're not just working on the symptoms with you, but they're getting to the root causes. Where did the trauma come from? Where is it in your body? How did it get created for you, and what went wrong, and how do you release and come to an understanding of what went wrong, and other causes of mental health conditions. Usually talk therapy is used in conjunction with other therapies, and it is one of the most widely used and respected forms of traditional therapy for various mental health issues, including trauma, PTSD, CPTSD, and depression and anxiety. And this therapy is usually used, like I said, with other forms of therapy, and that's the best way to use it. One form of talk therapy that I've actually gotten some help in myself with a therapist is internal family systems, also known as IFS. It's a model that's used in a lot of psychological literature, but I want to include an article on it because it's one system. It's a form of talk therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy, and so I wanted to include it here as a possibility for you. And internal family systems is an approach to psychotherapy that identifies and addresses multiple subpersonalities or families within each person's mental system. It's addressing different areas of your psyche. And those, because there is that part of you that's very fierce and protects you, and then there's the inner child part of you, and there's all these different angles and aspects of your personality, and it basically helps you to work with and through those wounded parts and painful emotions such as anger and shame by giving them a name and by having them as parts that try to control and protect the person from the pain of the wounded parts. So it helps you to sort of harmonize. It's an integrative approach in that sense. It's an integrative approach within your mind, and it's one form of talk therapy and of cognitive behavioral therapy. I'll include the article. It's in Psychology Today, but it's in Psychology Today, and it's called Internal Family Systems Therapy. I'll include it in the resources. Studies prove that talk therapy works, and IFS forms of this work. So I'll include that. And then other recommended resources, I think I've already included enough here. Check those out in the links. And then study what talk therapy and IFS are, and speak to a professional about what approach is best for you. I mean, that sounds obvious. I keep repeating it, but that is common sense. So just make sure that you're doing your homework and doing your research and finding the right therapist. That makes all the difference, more than the system you use, I think. But IFS is a great way to integrate the fragmented parts of your psyche. Trauma is a fragmented mind, and healing the trauma brings us back into our bodies, into full awareness, into wholeness, into integration. And IFS really helps you to integrate all those aspects of yourself. Almost like having lived underwater our whole lives and then coming up and seeing, hearing, and feeling everything in a real powerful way, in full living color and sound. That's what a lot of people who heal their trauma say, that they were like underwater and it was like blah, 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 and then all of a sudden they can hear clearly, they can see, they can smell, they can feel, they feel themselves here and now, alive and real in their own bodies, and before they didn't even feel real. Healing can happen, but it is hard work, and you have to find what works for you. And what works for you may change over time. So stay persistent, vigilant, and do something concrete every day towards your healing. Take breaks, but never give up. Okay? The last therapy that we're going to cover in all four of these, and in the guided practices to do with a licensed professional today, is dance or movement therapy. And again, when we did the body, we did the body practices. We did talked about exercise and different forms of exercise like yoga, tai chi, qigong, cardio, weights, sports, and so forth and so on, dance. But I wanted to use dance and movement therapy as its own category because there are licensed professionals, both psychologists and otherwise, who are professionals in dance, professionals in therapy, and they've taken the two and combined them. There's also a lot of research that theater, acting, and all of that is very therapeutic for trauma as well. So I didn't include that in this category or in the categories, but that might be one, if you're really interested in that might be helpful to explore as well. Check out theater therapy for trauma as well. So dance and movement therapy can be a great way to work through trauma. And it's great for your mind, and it's great for your body, right? Research shows that art, dance, yoga, tai chi, and martial arts, as well as dance, can help people work through the impacts of trauma. And there are people trained in these new therapies. They're pretty cutting edge, particularly dance and theater, as ways to express emotions and release trauma from the body. And that's why I believe that praise and worship is a healing process. It's very similar, even though you may not be dancing a lot. Maybe you do. Dance with your praise and worship. Go for it, if it works. And if you just want to do it because you love God, you love the Lord, do it, But read, I'll read a quotation in the third column in just a little bit. I have columns here for each of these categories, but the definition of dance therapy is also known as movement therapy, and it is designed to help people integrate the mental, physical, and emotional aspects of their lives through expressive movement. Dance therapists help clients feel better about themselves and overcome the issues in their lives that may be holding them back. And I will include an article that talks about dance therapy, and it's work.chron, that's CHRON.com. And this article just gives you a description of dance therapy and how it works. And there are dance therapists, so look them up in your local area, and you'll probably be able to find some really helpful information to find somebody who does this. A little bit more about dance therapy from this article. This is Chron, CHRON. And it's a job description for a dance therapist. So it just tells you basically what a dance therapist is, what they do, and how they help people. So you can understand how they might be able to help you if you find one. And then again, make sure that they know something about trauma and that they are compassionate and they understand the nature of the stuff. If they're helping you with trauma, I'm pretty sure they'll know something about how it works. But just make sure. There are many licensed professionals that can guide you if you're interested in movement or dance therapy to help heal trauma. And this is body work, so it's likely to be helpful and effective. And there are many forms of dance and movement therapy. So look up the resources here. I'll include them in the links, and speak to a professional and seek your own resources for what therapies might be best for you in terms of movement therapy. For some people, slow, deliberate movement may be more therapeutic and calming. For others, faster, more expressive forms of movement may be cathartic, and for some, maybe both, maybe at different times both. Explore different types by taking a class, see what resonates, pray, and see what is right for you. And dance therapy is pretty accepted in Christian communities. There's also an article in Digital Commons at leslie.edu. So it's digitalcommons.leslie.edu. And it's another article that provides some information on dance therapy. It's a scientific article, The Efficacy of Dance and Movement Therapy for Trauma-Affected Youth, a literature review. That one gets a little more technical. If it helps youth, then I believe it helps adults too, because children are different, but there's still a lot of common things there. So, but in this article, it says Hamann 2010 suggests that integrating the body into treatment for those who have experienced trauma can synchronize the endocrine system to inhibit proper functioning, and with a balanced system, trauma-affected clients can delve into cognitive processing. This gets kind of technical, but it's basically saying that it helps you to begin to integrate the different functions of the body and the mind that have been split off and fragmented by trauma. And it says the findings of this literature review revealed that dance movement therapy techniques such as body scanning, mirroring, and body-based coping skills may be efficacious interventions for children who have experienced trauma. However, further research is needed to qualify the efficacy of these methods. Body-based techniques such as dance movement therapy would likely be most effective if paired with top-down methods such as cognitive behavioral therapy. So again, the body and the mind therapies together work the best. And it says children, but like I said, if it works with children, it probably works with adults too. And there's an article that proves the connection between dance movement and healing trauma in the brain. And it's at a place called researchgate.net. researchgate.net. It shows the connection, like I said, between dance therapy and the healing of the brain. So that's pretty strong research that it will help a lot of people with healing their trauma. And it's, again, a scientific article. You can read it. I won't go into the details here because this podcast is already getting long. So let's go ahead and wrap it up. Advice and strategies from my experience of movement therapy. As with any exercise program, please consult a professional before taking a radically new kind of workout on. Start small and work into longer and more intensive forms gradually. There's a distinct link between movement, exercise, and the benefits of the body and brain. And since somatic and grounding therapies are so effective and trauma is often stored in the brain, body, and nervous system, it makes sense that specific kinds of movements would work the trauma out of the body, especially while doing the movement with a safe and competent professional around specific traumas. If you do this work targeted to specific trauma, please do so with the guidance of a medical or licensed professional. If you're just dancing to relieve stress, you don't need a guide. But if you're doing this for the trauma and you're bringing up specific traumas, find somebody who is both trained in body movement / dance and traumatic therapies, okay? And then make sure that they meet all the other qualifications that I was talking about earlier. But that wraps up our 4-part series of podcasts on practices for healing trauma. This was part 4, which included guided therapies with a professional, particularly body therapies, but also some mind therapies. And like I said, I believe that these therapies are a gift from God, and where traditional therapies may not completely help you release the trauma from the body, there are so many wonderful strategies that can help you now, so many modalities, so many practices that you need to explore, experiment, and try them And then when you find something that works, be consistent. Take a break and come back to it. When you fall down, you get back up. When you fall down, you get back up. When you go away, you come back. When you go away, you come back. God is your anchor. Your breath is your other anchor. And whatever practices you do, make sure that you're doing breathing. Make sure that you remember that God and Christ are your anchor in the mind, and know that you are loved and you can heal, and God will heal you. And these practices are God's gift to us to help us to heal. Use discretion, use discernment, pray, seek guidance, and do the research and do the healing work every day. And I promise, over the course of months and years, if you're doing this work consistently and putting your full self into it, you will see results. I've seen results. And I'm so privileged to be able to go on this journey with you and to be able to help you to heal. And this series of podcasts, this is the last one for this series. So it's been a privilege. It's been so much fun to record these. I don't know who's listening. I don't know how many people are getting something out of this, but it has just been a wonderful journey to record these podcasts. I will be putting out more resources, including more podcasts in the near future. Thank you so much for going on this journey with me. Remember that God loves you. God will heal you. There's nothing wrong with you. What happened to you was not your fault, but you can take accountability now and you can heal. God will heal you, beloved. God loves you. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. And I'll include the links to the YouTube channel, the Facebook group, and the podcast below. Also, keep in mind, I am a writing coach that can help you write a transformational book, and you can check that out at rachelleroy.com, RACHELLEROY.com. Thank you so much. God bless, and have a great day.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode of Christian Emotional Recovery, hosted by Rachel Leroy. For links to this week's resources and to join the discussion, check out this episode's show notes at christianemotionalrecovery.com, where you can also find links to our YouTube channel and Facebook group. Join our email list and get other episodes and resources. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate and review the podcast and tell a friend who may benefit from this message. See you next time. And remember, beloveds, God loves you, and you are fearfully and wonderfully made.